Hello and welcome to this my second video for the Survey of English Literature course. Today we're going to talk about William Shakespeare and his two most well-known genres of play that he wrote in the comedy and tragedy. So when William Shakespeare, or perhaps you could call him Young Will, arrived in London, likely in the late 1580s or early 1590s, to start a career in the theater industry, he started out as an actor who might have apprenticed as a playwright, writing and rewriting bits of theatrical scripts when he was not on stage. Most likely, he worked under tutelage of a more established playwright such as Thomas Middleton. As theater was a collaborative industry at the time, so was the writing of its scripts. Some of the scenes in plays by Thomas Middleton and his contemporaries might have been written by Shakespeare. In turn, some scenes in Shakespeare's plays might have been written by other contemporary playwrights or his apprentices. The two most popular dramatic genres of the time when Shakespeare started writing plays were history and comedy, although tragedy was starting to gain traction at that time. The popularity of these genres prompted Shakespeare to start writing in these two genres. Histories or historical plays were often attempted by young and less experienced playwrights who chose to work with the established plots or narratives of historical events or figures, which they would later embellish with additional scenes and characters. For Shakespeare, for instance, the narrative qualities and thoroughness of Holinshed's Chronicles, a big book of British and surrounding kingdoms' histories, provided him with the storylines for his early history plays, such as Henry VI, whose first part might have been co-written with Thomas Nash. He would later revisit the Chronicles later in his career and used it as an inspiration for some of his more well-known tragedies, such as Hamlet and Macbeth. Shakespeare also started writing comedies around the same time he started writing historical plays. Ian Johnston, a Shakespeare scholar, recognized that the great theme of Shakespeare's plays, especially his comedy, is disorder. In Shakespeare's comedies, something out of the order typically occurs, such as in the plot of the separated and misidentified twins in the Twelfth Night and the Comedy of Errors, which we're going to discuss on Friday. The disorder is later resolved when everyone recognizes what has been going on, and according to Ian Johnston, everyone learns from it, forgives, forgets, and reestablishes his or her identity in the smoothly functioning social group, which may return to the original normality or may be setting up a better situation than the one the group started with. The main characters in a Shakespeare comedy will normally have this initial urge to seek to restore that normality, to get back to what they have lost. Initially, they will be unsuccessful and they will have to adapt to unfamiliar changes, funny or otherwise. Comedies, including Shakespeare's comedies, typically end with a group celebration, especially one associated with a betrothal or a wedding, often accompanied by music and dancing. The emphasis is on the reintegration of everyone into the group, a recommitment to their shared life together. Shakespeare's influence in writing comedies, including the two titles mentioned before, originated with the ancient Greeks, but the form never really had to be reinvented or passed down because it is a vital element in most dramatic rituals which communities routinely celebrate on important occasions. So, to put his comedies in their historical context, the complex tonal shifts of Shakespeare's comedy are conveyed in part by the pervasive music and in part by the constant oscillation between his blank verse and prose writing. Generally, the characters in the main romantic plot speak in the more elevated, aristocratic, and dignified register of verse. while the comic subplot, which involves comic relief characters, proceeds in prose along with the employment of certain comic elements such as slapsticks. Along with his contemporaries, Shakespeare was considered to be one of the most influential writers that enhanced and elevated the use of blank verse in dramatic writing, which further carried over to his later tragedies and romance or tragicomedy plays. It also needs to be considered that in Shakespeare time, a theater company consisted only of male performers. So the success of the performance of a comedy also depends upon an actor's ability to transform himself through costume, voice, and gesture. For example, in the Twelfth Night, an actor has to be able to transform into a young noble woman, Viola, who also transformed herself through costume, voice, and gesture into a young man, Cesario. The play's delicious complications follow from the emotional tangles that these transformations engender, unsettling fixed categories of sexual identity and social class, and allowing characters to explore emotional territory that a culture officially hostile to same sex desire and cross class marriage would ordinarily have ruled out of bounds. So let's move on to Shakespeare's tragedies. The tradition of writing tragedies began in the ancient Greece. Ancient Roman thinker Aristotle, in his Poetics, later attempted to define and theorize the tragedies of his Greek predecessors, such as Sophocles and Euripides, and fellow Romans, as a process of imitating an action which has serious implications, is complete, and possesses magnitude. By means of language which has been made sensuously attractive, with each of its varieties found separately in the parts, enacted by the persons themselves and not presented through narrative, through a course of pity and fear completing the purification or catharsis of such emotions. From the explanation of this complex and loaded definition, certain elements of tragedy could be identified and retained for centuries. The genre, most importantly, necessitates the existence of a tragic hero, uh, commonly defined as a great man, commonly defined by Aristotle as a great man who is neither a paragon of virtue and justice nor undergoes the change to misfortune through any real badness or wickedness, but because of some fatal flaw or tragic flaw, or in Aristotle's Latin, it's called hamartia. The great man falls through not because of some weakness of character, some moral blindness, or error. The structural and the artistic format of the Elizabethan English tragedy of the 16th and the 17th century was largely influenced by the tragedies attributed to Seneca, a Roman playwright and philosopher who also happened to be a reader of Aristotle's work. The first English tragedy in blank verse, Gorboduc, published in 1561 by Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville, features heavy Senecan influence in its violent plots, resounding rhetorical speeches, and ghosts thirsting for blood, as Seneca's plays are also known to include supernatural elements. The popularity of the Senecan influence gave rise to the invented genre of revenge tragedy, in which a wrong protagonist plots and executes revenge, destroying himself or herself in the process. An early, highly influential example of the revenge tragedy in English is Thomas Kyd's Spanish Tragedy, published in 1592. And despite its unprecedented psychological complexity, Shakespeare's Hamlet is also part of this modern English dramatic tradition. Shakespeare started writing more tragedies in the 17th century, following the death of Queen Elizabeth I. His tragedies might reflect the mood of the country after the death of the Queen, but they might also represent the reigning King James I's theatrical preferences. In the more modern Shakespearean understanding of tragedy, the tragic hero sets out to deal with the conflict by himself, or at least entirely on his own terms. And as things start to get more complicated, generally the tragic figure will simply redouble his efforts, increasingly persuaded that he can deal with what is happening only on his own. In that sense, tragic heroes are passionately egocentric, according to Ian Johnston, and unwilling to compromise their powerful sense of their own identity in the face of unwelcome facts. They will not let themselves answer to any communal system of value, they answer only to themselves. The conflicts in Shakespeare's tragedies are resolved only with the death of the main character, or the tragic hero, who usually discovers just before his death that his attempt to control the conflict and make his way through it have simply compounded his difficulties, and that, therefore, to a large extent, the dire situation he is in is largely of his own making. This differs from the ancient Greek and Roman tragedies, which may focus on the reversal of the fate, or peripeteia, and suffering or pathos of the hero, but they do not always end in the hero's death, such as, for example, in Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. The prevalence of death in Shakespeare's plays may have been largely influenced by the violent and fatal endings of revenge tragedies, which proved to be popular with the Elizabethan and early Jacobean English audience. Shakespeare's first tragedy, Titus Andronicus or Titus Andronicus, published for the first time in 1594, was written during the time when he would have commonly written histories and comedies. Titus Andronicus seems to pander to this popularity of violence and death, as it is the bloodiest and the bloodiest of Shakespeare's plays, and it has the highest body count among other Shakespearean tragedies. The death of the hero, however, is not normally the very last thing in a tragedy, for there is commonly, especially in the tradition of Greek tragedy, some group lament over the body of the fallen hero, a reflection upon the significance of the life which has now ended. Some of Shakespeare's best known speeches are these laments. The final action of a tragedy is then the carrying out of the corpse. The social group has formed again, but in restoring the disorder, it's different from the restoration brought about by comedies, in which the social group has formed again, but only as a result of the sacrifice of the main characters, and the emphasis in the group is in a much lower key as they ponder the significance of the life of the dead hero. In that sense, the ending of a tragedy is looking back over what has happened, while the ending of comedy is looking forward to a joyful future. As the last part of this video, let's talk about the problem with classifying Shakespeare's plays. While the classical classification first introduced with the publication of Shakespeare's first folio in 1623, only consists of three categories: histories, comedies, and tragedies. In reality, there are overlaps among these three classic categories. Some of the main characters in his history plays, such as in Richard III, the King Richard III himself, the character possesses tragic qualities that would qualify him for a tragic hero. In turn, some of Shakespeare's tragedies were influenced by passages in history or by historical figures such as Hamlet and Macbeth. Some of Shakespeare's later plays begin with tragic disorders, but their endings are comedic, in the sense that in the end everyone gathers and social normality is restored without a sacrifice, prompting certain critics to classify these plays as either romance or tragicomedy. Even certain Shakespeare's comedies do not contain the common comedic elements found in his other comedies or in comedies commonly produced in the Elizabethan era, such as Mistaken Identity or Separated Twins or the farcical and more slapstick jokes. In The Merchant of Venice, for example, the play that we're going to also discuss on Friday, the comedy seems to rely on the understanding of its contemporary context and on the knowledge of certain stereotypes perpetuated during that era. Right? So next on Friday, we're going to talk more about a Shakespeare's plays. We're going to pick two comedies and one tragedy. Those two comedies are going to be The Comedy of Errors and The Merchant of Venice, and the tragedy is going to be Hamlet. All right. So I'll see you synchronously on Friday. Have a good rest of your day. And yeah, bye.